life turned into a gray blur of identical days sometime after I turned 30. Every morning I woke up in my one-room apartment on the city outskirts, where the only wall decorations were the faded outlines of paintings left by previous tenants. The coffee maker hissed in the small kitchen, signaling the start of yet another day indistinguishable from the last. My job at a small IT company consumed all my time and energy, but it only paid enough to cover bills and buy essentials. My colleagues were friendly but superficial. We exchanged polite small talk about the weather or work, but no one showed interest in my inner world or personal life. Evenings were spent at home, staring at my laptop screen or scrolling through social media feeds where everyone seemed so happy and successful. I had almost no friends left. Some had moved to other cities, others got married and immersed themselves in family life, and some just drifted away for reasons I never understood. My last relationship ended over a year ago, and since then, I'd been living in an emotional vacuum. Anna left quietly, without arguments or explanations, simply saying we had become strangers living side by side but not together. Maybe she was right. I had indeed become withdrawn and distant, lost in my thoughts and worries. That winter was particularly harsh and long. Snow blanketed the city in a thick layer, turning familiar streets into featureless white corridors. In the evenings, I often stood by the window, watching the rare passers-by hurrying along the sidewalks, bundled in warm coats and scarves. Sometimes it felt like I was observing life as an outsider, not participating in it. Loneliness became more tangible, especially during those long winter evenings when darkness fell early, and my apartment felt too quiet and empty. It was on one such evening, with the wind howling outside and wet snow lashing against the window, that I decided to try something new. While browsing the internet for distractions, I stumbled upon an ad for a dating app called Soul Connect. The name intrigued me. Connection of Souls. The description claimed it wasn't an ordinary dating app, but a platform for finding deep, spiritual connections between people. The developers promised a unique matching algorithm based not only on appearance and interests, but also on deeper psychological traits. Registration was simple but unusually detailed. Beyond the standard questions about age, education, and hobbies, the app asked a series of odd questions. What do you feel when you're alone in complete darkness? Do you believe in life after death? Which historical period fascinates you most, and why? Describe the most vivid dream you remember. These questions seemed unusual for a typical dating site, but I answered them honestly, thinking the more information I provided, the better the matches would be. A few days after registering, I received my first match notification. Her name was Elena, 28 years old, a literature teacher. In her photo, she was attractive, but something in her gaze seemed sad and distant. Her profile mentioned that she loved old books, classical music, and long walks through the city at night. I was intrigued by her favorite historical period, the early 20th century, and her note that she felt a special connection to that era. I sent her a message and she replied quickly. Her writing style was unusual. She wrote in long, beautiful sentences, using words and phrases rarely heard in everyday speech. We exchanged a few messages about literature and music, and I felt she was a genuinely interesting conversationalist. Elena mentioned she lived in an old part of the city, in a house built in the early 20th century, and that she loved the atmosphere of that time. She suggested meeting in an old park near the historical museum, saying the place held special meaning for her. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with pleasant anticipation. I even bought a new shirt and tidied myself up, something I hadn't done in a while. Elena kept sending messages, each one thoughtful and deep, She wrote about her thoughts and feelings as if we'd known each other for years. Sometimes her messages felt odd. She often mentioned the past, saying how much things had changed recently without clarifying what she meant. Work that week was particularly intense. We were developing a new system for a local hospital, and I spent long hours reviewing archives and old databases. Strangely, some records dated back to the early 20th century. Apparently, the hospital had existed for a long time, and patient data had accumulated over decades. While browsing these old records, I occasionally came across familiar names and surnames, which wasn't surprising in a small city where many families had lived for generations. The evening before my meeting with Elena, I decided to review her profile in the app again. I noticed she hadn't provided her phone number and preferred to communicate only through the app. When I suggested exchanging contacts, she politely declined, saying she'd rather meet in person first. That seemed reasonable. Many people are cautious about sharing personal information online. Studying her photos, I noticed another peculiarity. All her pictures were taken in old places, parks with vintage benches in front of historic buildings or in museums. In one photo, she stood next to an old monument that looked familiar, but I couldn't recall where I'd seen it. Elena looked the same in every picture. Beautiful, but with that same sad expression in her eyes that I'd noticed from the start. The day of the meeting was overcast and cold. I arrived at the old park a bit early and strolled through the alleys, admiring the monuments and ancient trees. The park was indeed very old. Many paths were paved with cobblestones, and the benches and lanterns looked over a century old. I found the meeting spot, a bench by a small pond, as Elena had described. Sitting down, I waited, occasionally checking my watch and phone. The meeting time came and went, but Elena didn't show up. I waited another half hour, thinking she might be delayed by traffic or other circumstances. Finally, assuming something had happened, I sent her a message through the app. Her reply came quickly. She apologized and asked to reschedule for the next day, explaining that urgent matters had come up. I was disappointed, but decided not to make a big deal out of it. Things like this happen. That evening, I received another notification from the app about a new match. This time, it was a man named Victor, 35 years old, a historian by profession. This struck me as odd. I had specified in my settings that I was seeking relationships with women, but I figured it might be a technical glitch, or that Victor was looking for friendly conversation. His profile was intriguing. He studied the history of our city and was writing a book about local landmarks. In his message, he noted my interest in history and suggested meeting to show me some lesser-known places. My correspondence with Victor turned out to be fascinating. He shared incredible facts about the city I'd never known, despite living here my whole life. Apparently, in the early 20th century, our city was far more prosperous and developed than it is now. Victor wrote about old factories, theaters, and mansions, most of which no longer existed. His stories were so vivid and detailed that it sometimes felt like he had witnessed those events himself. The next day, my meeting with Elena fell through again. She sent an apology 30 minutes before the scheduled time, saying she felt unwell. I started noticing a pattern in her behavior. She was very active in our chats, but always found reasons to cancel in-person meetings. It was disappointing, but I resolved not to give up and suggested meeting the following weekend. Elena agreed, but her messages took on a strange insistence. She repeatedly stressed that it was crucial we meet at the exact place she'd chosen, at a specific time, 9 in the evening. When I asked why so late, she replied that the park had a special atmosphere in the evening, and she felt more comfortable there. Meanwhile, Victor continued sending his captivating stories about the city's history. He offered to show me an old, abandoned cemetery on the outskirts, where many prominent citizens from the early 20th century were buried. According to him, the tombstones were works of art. I agreed to the tour, thinking it would be interesting and might distract me from my failed attempts to meet Elena. Victor said he'd meet me at the cemetery entrance on Saturday at 6 in the evening, when the setting sun would provide the best lighting for viewing the old monuments. On Friday evening, I decided to focus on work to take my mind off the upcoming meetings. While continuing to work on the hospital archives, I stumbled upon some curious documents. Among the records from the 1920s, I found mention of a major epidemic that had struck the city. Many residents died within a few months, and the hospital struggled to cope with the influx of patients. What struck me most was that among the deceased was a young woman named Elena Morozova, 28 years old, a teacher at a local school. The coincidence of her name and age with my app acquaintance seemed strange, but I dismissed it as a fluke. Elena is a common name. Digging further into the documents, I found even more intriguing information. Among the epidemic's victims was a man named Viktor Petrovich Sokolov, 35 years old, a local historian and antiquarian. My heart raced. 2 coincidences in a row no longer felt random. I tried to find more information about these people, but the archives from that period were incomplete. Many documents were damaged by time or lost. Still, I confirmed that both Elena Morozova and Viktor Sokolov were buried in the same old cemetery Viktor had invited me to visit. That night I had a strange dream. I was walking through a snow-covered park, and a female figure in an old-fashioned coat approached me. As she drew closer, I saw Elena's face, but it was pale and sorrowful. She reached out to me and spoke, but I couldn't make out her words. Snow swirled around us and everything faded into a white haze. I woke up with an unsettling dream so vivid that I couldn't tell if it was a dream or something real. Saturday was frosty and clear. After work, I headed to meet Victor at the old cemetery. The place was even more desolate than I'd imagined. The tall, wrought iron fence was rusted and partially collapsed, and the gates hung on a single hinge. The cemetery grounds were overgrown with weeds and young trees, and many tombstones were tilted or partially ruined. I waited at the entrance for about 20 minutes, but Victor didn't show. Thinking he might be delayed or had trouble finding me in the dark, I ventured into the cemetery alone. Walking among the old graves, I was struck by the beauty and variety of the tombstones. Many were true works of art, carved angels, intricate patterns, marble statues. Despite the neglect, the place had a unique atmosphere, a solemn sadness. I moved slowly along the main path, reading names and dates on the monuments. Most burials dated from the late 19th to early 20th century. The names were old-fashioned, and many surnames were unfamiliar in the modern city. By chance, as I veered off the main path, I stumbled upon 2 tombstones that stopped me in my tracks. One was inscribed, Elena Alexandrovna Morozova, 1892-1920, teacher, beloved daughter, and mentor. The neighboring stone read, Viktor Petrovich Sokolov, 1885-1920, historian, antiquarian, researcher of our land. The dates of death matched the hospital records. I stood before these graves, feeling a chill run down my spine. The coincidences were no longer random. On Elena's tombstone was a short epitaph. Time has no power over love, and death cannot part hearts. On Victor's was, history lives in those who remember. I snapped photos of both tombstones with my phone, though the images came out blurry in the twilight. Standing by these graves, I felt an eerie presence, as if someone were watching me from behind the trees. I turned around a few times but saw no one. The wind rustled dry leaves and made the old trees creak. Back home, I immediately opened the app and closely examined Elena and Victor's profiles. Now, many details took on new meaning. Elena was indeed a teacher, just like the woman buried in the cemetery. Victor studied the city's history, just like the historian from the early 20th century. Their interests, hobbies, and even their communication style all pointed to a strange connection with people who died 100 years ago. But the most unsettling part was that their photos in the app looked modern, their faces vibrant and young. I tried to find a logical explanation. Perhaps they were descendants who, for some reason, used their ancestors' names. Or maybe someone was playing a cruel prank, creating fake profiles based on information from the cemetery. But the more I thought about it, the less convincing these rational theories seemed. Too many coincidences. Too many details that couldn't be faked or guessed. Late that evening, I received a message from Elena. She wrote that she deeply regretted that we hadn't met yet and insisted on meeting the next day, Sunday. Her tone was more urgent, almost pleading. She said it was crucial that we meet, that she had something important to share. At the end of the message, she added a line that made me freeze. Time is slipping away, and soon it will be too late. Some meetings cannot be postponed forever. Victor also sent a message apologizing for not showing up at the cemetery. He explained that urgent matters had come up but urged me not to be upset. He wanted to show me another intriguing place, an old house where many prominent city figures once lived. According to him, the house had a rich history and was the site of remarkable events. He suggested meeting there on Monday evening, adding that the place was especially fascinating after dark. Sunday morning was spent in anxious reflection. The rational part of my mind urged me to end these strange connections and delete the app. But curiosity outweighed fear. I wanted to understand what was happening, who was behind these mysterious profiles, and why they needed to meet me. Besides, despite the oddities, communicating with Elena and Victor was the only bright spot in my dull life. They were engaging conversationalists, and their stories captivated me more than anything had in months. Around noon, I decided to visit the city library to find more information about Elena Morozova and Viktor Sokolov. In the archive section, I found some old newspapers from that period. An October 1920 issue contained an article about the epidemic ravaging the city. The journalist wrote that the disease primarily struck young, healthy people, and doctors couldn't find an effective treatment. Among the victims were many respected citizens, including young teacher Elena Morozova, who continued caring for her students until her final days, and antiquarian Viktor Sokolov, working on a book about our city's history. Another newspaper reported that the epidemic began suddenly and ended just as abruptly, leaving hundreds dead. The author noted strange circumstances surrounding the illness. Many patients, in their delirium, spoke of seeing deceased relatives and friends calling them to follow. Some claimed the dead visited them in dreams, describing a world awaiting them after death. Doctors attributed this to the disease's effect on the brain, but families insisted their loved ones describe details they couldn't have known. One story particularly struck me. A young man who survived the epidemic. He claimed that during his illness, spirits of the dead visited him, trying to persuade him to join them. He said the dead felt lonely in their world and sought ways to connect with the living. This man believed the epidemic wasn't just an infection, but a mystical event that opened a boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead. Reading these articles, my anxiety grew. Too many parallels with what was happening to me now. The dating app matching me with long-dead people, their persistent attempts to meet me, strange coincidences and inexplicable details. It all formed a picture that defied logic and reason. That evening, I decided to meet Elena anyway. Curiosity and a morbid fascination with the mystery were stronger than fear. I arrived at the park early and paced the alleys, trying to calm myself. The park at dusk looked entirely different from daytime. Shadows cast by trees formed eerie patterns on the paths, and the old lanterns gave off a dim, yellowish glow that emphasized the darkness rather than dispelled it. At exactly 9, I approached the designated spot, the bench by the pond. No one was there. I sat down, waiting, glancing at my watch and listening to the sounds of the night. Somewhere in the distance, faint music played, perhaps from nearby houses. Leaves rustled, and occasionally a cat darted by or a nocturnal creature cried out. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Elena was still absent. Suddenly, I felt someone watching me. Turning, I saw a female figure standing under an old oak a few meters from the bench. In the dim light, it was hard to make out her face, but her silhouette and clothing resembled Elena's from the photos. She moved slowly toward me, and with each step, my heart pounded faster. When she came closer, I saw her face, and the world around me seemed to freeze. It was indeed Elena from the photos, but something was wrong. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and her eyes were filled with such deep sorrow that a single glance took my breath away. She wore a long, dark, old-fashioned coat that rustled with every movement. When she spoke, her voice sounded like a distant echo, as if coming from the depths of a well. She told me about her life, her work at the school, and the children she taught. But it was all in the past tense, like memories of long-gone days. Elena spoke of her love for teaching, her desire to change the world through education. She described her students by name, their personalities, and their dreams. It was strange to hear her talk about people who, if still alive, would now be elderly. Gradually, her story grew darker. She spoke of the illness that swept through the city like a black shadow, how her colleagues, friends, and students died one by one, how she felt the first symptoms but kept working, unwilling to abandon her students. Elena described her final days with such detail that I felt uneasy. She spoke of lying in a hospital ward, hearing the moans of other patients, and watching doctors helplessly shrug, unable to help. The most terrifying part was when she described her death, how she felt life slipping from her body, saw a light at the end of a tunnel but didn't follow it. Instead, she stayed here, tethered to the world of the living by unfinished business and unfulfilled dreams. She said death wasn't an end, but a transition to another state of existence, where time flowed differently, and the boundaries between past and present blurred. I sat on the bench, mesmerized by her story, yet horrified by the realization of what was happening. Elena had been dead for 100 years, yet somehow she could communicate with me, appear before me, and tell her story. When I tried to stand and leave, she placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was icy, and I felt the cold seep deep into my bones. She begged me not to go, saying she was lonely in her world, and that the living were her only connection to what she held dear in life. Elena explained that Soul Connect wasn't an ordinary dating app. It was a magical platform created by someone who understood the nature of connections between the living and the dead. The matching algorithm didn't use typical compatibility factors, but worked with deep soul connections that persisted beyond death. Those strange questions during registration were designed to determine how open someone was to contact with the other world, and how strong their ties to the past and the deceased were. She said the dead suffered loneliness as much as, or more than, the living. In their world, there is no time as we know it, no progress, no change. Only an eternal existence in a state of incompleteness, burdened by unfulfilled desires and unspoken words. The app gave them a chance to find living people who could understand them, listen, perhaps even help complete what was left unfinished in life. When Elena finished, I felt a strange blend of fear and empathy. On one hand, it was madness, defying nature and logic. On the other, her story was so human and touching that I couldn't dismiss it as a hallucination or prank. She asked me to visit her again the next day, saying she had something important to show me. Then she vanished into the night shadows as suddenly as she'd appeared. I returned home in utter turmoil. Everything felt unreal, yet the memories of the encounter were too vivid and detailed to be a dream or fantasy. I couldn't sleep until morning, replaying every word, every detail of her appearance, every nuance of her voice. By dawn, I'd nearly convinced myself it was a hallucination caused by stress and overwork. But when I checked the app, there was a new message from Elena. She thanked me for the meeting and asked me to meet her that evening at the old cemetery, by her grave. She wrote that she wanted to show me something important that would help me understand the nature of the connection between our worlds. At the end, she noted that time flowed differently for her, and that each day without contact with the living world brought her unbearable suffering. At work, I couldn't focus. Colleagues asked several times if I was okay, noticing my distracted state. I kept working on the hospital archives, but now every death record from 1920 made me flinch. It felt like each name hid a story like Elena's, a soul trapped between worlds, yearning for connection with the living. During lunch, I received a message from Victor. He apologized for missing our meeting and suggested meeting that evening at the old house he'd mentioned earlier. He said the house had a unique energy and was a place where past and present met in remarkable ways. Victor insisted I come tonight, explaining that it was a special day when the boundaries between worlds grew thinner. That evening, I faced a choice. Go to Elena at the cemetery or meet Victor at the house. Ultimately, I decided to see Elena first, then find Victor if I had the time and strength. The cemetery was even gloomier at night than during the day. I walked the familiar path to Elena's grave, lighting my way with my phone's flashlight. Every rustle, every shadow made me turn and listen. Elena's tombstone was surrounded by a strange glow which I initially thought was moonlight reflecting off the marble. But as I approached, it became clear the light emanated from the monument itself. Elena stood beside her grave, looking even more ghostly than the previous night. Her figure was translucent, and her clothes fluttered in a breeze I couldn't feel. She told me about what happened to her after death, how she wandered between worlds, confused by her state, how she gradually understood her new existence and learned to interact with the living world. Eleanor explained that the dead could affect the physical world, but only under specific conditions and with great effort. Creating Soul Connect required the combined energy of many souls, each contributing a fragment of their essence to the project. She showed me her world. Around us, shadows of other dead appeared wandering the cemetery. Some were as clear as Elena, others barely visible silhouettes. All seemed lost, searching for something or someone. Eleanor explained that not all the dead found peace. Those who died suddenly with unfinished business or strong emotional ties often remained bound to the earthly world. Many such souls lingered after the 1920 epidemic. The disease wasn't just physical, it was mystical. It weakened the boundaries between worlds, allowing many souls to remain in limbo. Eleanor said they had been trying to contact the living ever since, but until modern technology, it was nearly impossible. The internet and digital platforms provided new opportunities. The most terrifying revelation was the purpose of these contacts. The dead didn't just want to connect out of loneliness. They wanted to return to life, and that required the life energy of a living person. Each interaction, each encounter, allowed them to draw on this energy, becoming more material and capable of influencing the physical world. Elena admitted she had met other living people through various means, and each contact made her stronger. I felt horror as I realized what was happening. All those days of chatting with Elena and Victor, they'd been feeding on my energy. I recalled feeling recently exhausted, struggling to focus at work. It wasn't stress or coincidence, it was the result of their interactions. I tried to leave, but Elena grabbed my arm. Her touch was no longer just cold, but painful, as if she were draining my very life. She spoke faster, more insistently. She said she didn't want to harm me, that she only wanted to live again. She had plans, dreams she hadn't fulfilled. Death had cut her life short at its peak, and she deserved a second chance. Elena said if I helped her, she could return and continue her work. She'd be eternally grateful and find a way to repay me. But I knew the price of this favor was my own life. Elena didn't say it outright, but I felt myself weakening with every minute of our conversation. My vision blurred, and my breathing grew labored. With effort, I broke free from her grip and ran toward the cemetery exit. Behind me, I heard her voice, no longer sad, but angry. She shouted that I didn't understand what I was rejecting, that this was my only chance to be part of something greater. Reaching my car, I started the engine with trembling hands and drove home. In the rearview mirror, I saw a strange fog rising over the cemetery, with countless silhouettes flickering within. It felt like all the dead buried there had risen from their graves, watching me leave. At home, I opened the app, intending to delete my account, but found the delete button didn't work. Worse, I had new matches, 5 more contacts, all with names and photos of people from the early 20th century. They had already sent messages, introducing themselves and suggesting meetings. Each message was written in the same style as Elena's and Victor's, eloquent, detailed, with old-fashioned phrases. They shared their interests, which eerily aligned with mine. One was an artist wanting to show me his paintings. Another was a musician who'd composed beautiful melodies but never performed them in life. A third was a writer with unpublished manuscripts. The most frightening part was that I felt tempted to respond. Despite the horror of my encounter with Elena, their stories intrigued me, and they seemed compelling conversationalists. I wanted to learn more about their lives, their era, their creations and dreams. I knew this desire wasn't entirely mine, that it was somehow induced by the app, but I couldn't fully resist it. That night, I had nightmares. I saw myself in the cemetery, lying in a grave, surrounded by Elena, Victor, and countless other ghostly figures. They thanked me for letting them return to life, but their gratitude sounded like mockery. I knew I was dead, but couldn't do anything about it. In the dream, I tried to scream, but made no sound. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling like someone had been standing by my bed, watching me. The next morning I felt worse than ever. Weakness consumed my body, and in the mirror, I saw a pale, gaunt face with dark circles under my eyes. I looked like I hadn't slept in weeks. I took the bus to work, not trusting myself to drive in such a state. Colleagues noticed my condition and suggested I take sick leave, but I refused, terrified of being alone with my thoughts and fears. All day, I searched for information about Soul Connect. There were almost no mentions online, except for a few forums where users complained about the app's strange behavior. Some said they couldn't delete it from their phones. Others described odd contacts who knew too much about the city's past. One user claimed that after weeks of using the app, they began seeing ghosts in real life, and their health deteriorated rapidly. The most chilling was a post from someone who believed the app was created by the dead, using modern technology as a bridge between worlds. By evening, my condition worsened so much I could barely stand. My hands shook, my heart beat irregularly, and dark spots flickered before my eyes. At home, I tried again to delete the app, but now it not only refused to uninstall, it began opening on my phone screen on its own. Messages from new contacts arrived every few minutes, each more insistent and threatening. The artist Dmitry wrote that he'd created a portrait just for me, and that I must come see it. He claimed it wasn't just a painting, but a window to another world that would reveal the true nature of beauty and art. The musician Andrei insisted I come hear his composition, which would open new dimensions of musical perception. The writer Maria promised to show me a manuscript that would change my understanding of literature and life. All scheduled meetings for that evening in different parts of the city, all emphasizing their importance. The most terrifying realization was that I wanted to go to them. Despite the horror and weakness, despite knowing the danger, something inside me craved these meetings. I wanted to see Dmitry's paintings, hear Andrei's music, read Maria's work. This desire was so strong that I knew it wasn't entirely mine. The dead were influencing my thoughts and emotions, making me more susceptible to their calls. Around 9, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone and hadn't ordered anything, but the knock repeated, persistent and rhythmic. Peering through the peephole, I saw no one. The hallway was empty, yet the knocking continued. When I opened the door, Victor stood on the threshold. The same historian I'd corresponded with. He looked exactly like his profile photos, but his presence was eerie and unnatural. Victor entered without waiting for an invitation and began talking about the house he wanted to show me. He said it was vital that the house held answers to all questions about the connection between worlds. His voice was hypnotic, and I felt my will weakening with every word. Victor explained that the house was built on the site of an old cemetery and designed by an architect as a conduit between the living and the dead. In its basement was a portal through which deceased souls could return to life. He revealed the truth about Soul Connect. It was created by a group of souls who learned to use electromagnetic fields and digital technology to interact with the living world. Every person who used the app became a potential donor of life energy. The algorithm didn't just match people. It sought out those with strong spiritual sensitivity, lonely and emotionally unstable, who were easier to manipulate and whose energy was easier to drain. Victor explained that the return process required a complete transfer of life energy from a living person to a dead one. The living person died, and the dead gained a chance to live again in the physical world. He argued it was fair, that the dead deserved a second life, especially those who died young and unfulfilled. He said my life was empty and meaningless, that I wasn't happy or contributing to the world, while they could achieve so much more. Listening to him, I felt my last remnants of will fade. Victor was right. My life was indeed gray and purposeless. I had no family, no close friends, no significant accomplishments. Maybe it would be better if my life energy went to someone who could use it better. These thoughts entered my mind, but I knew they weren't entirely mine. Victor was planting them, using my depression and loneliness against me. We left my apartment and drove to the house he'd described. It was an old 3-story building in the city's historic district, built in the early 20th century. The facade was adorned with strange symbols and bas reliefs that, upon closer inspection, depicted skeletons, skulls, and other grim motifs. The windows were boarded up and the front door looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. But when Victor approached, it swung open on its own with a long creak. Inside, the house was dark and cold. The air was stale, reeking of decay and dampness. Victor led me through corridors, illuminating the way with an unnatural glow emanating from him. Portraits of people in old-fashioned clothing hung on the walls, and they seemed alive. Their eyes followed us, and their lips moved as if whispering. In some rooms I saw ghostly figures engaged in tasks, reading books, playing instruments, painting. All were dead but continued existing in this house, waiting for their chance to return to life. Victor brought me to the basement where the portal was located. It was a circular room with a high, domed ceiling, centered around a strange altar surrounded by glowing runes. Around the altar stood Elena and the other souls I'd corresponded with through the app. They looked more solid than before, as if they'd already partially returned to life by draining energy from me and others. Elena approached and took my hands. Her touch was no longer just cold, it burned. She explained that the ritual was nearly complete. All I had to do was lie on the altar and let them take the remaining energy. She promised it wouldn't hurt, that I'd simply sleep and be free of loneliness and depression. In return, one of them would gain a new life of creativity and achievement. My legs carried me toward the altar. Resisting was nearly impossible. Their combined will overwhelmed my weakened state. But at the last moment, something in me rebelled. Perhaps it was survival instinct or a final spark of human dignity. I realized I didn't want to die, even if my life wasn't perfect. I still had chances to change, to find meaning, to become better. Death wasn't the solution to my problems. I tried to break free, but the dead surrounded me in a tight circle. Their faces no longer showed sadness or loneliness, only greed and cruelty. They wanted life at any cost, even if it meant killing an innocent person. Victor grabbed my shoulders and dragged me toward the altar, while the others chanted a spell in an unknown language. The air glowed, and the runes on the walls and floor flared brightly. In desperation, I pulled up my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Instead, the screen lit up, showing Soul Connect. I realized the phone was their tool, their means of controlling me. With all my strength, I smashed it against the floor, shattering it. The dead screamed in pain, and their grip weakened. The connection was broken, giving me a chance to escape. I ran toward the basement exit, but the door was locked. Behind me, I heard the dead's cries and curses as they tried to regain control. Finding an old metal pipe in a corner, I began breaking down the door. The wood gave way, and I fled into the corridor. The house now looked different. Walls rotted before my eyes. The ceiling crumbled, and the air filled with ghostly moans. I raced toward the front door, stumbling over broken boards and dodging falling plaster. An army of dead pursued me. Not just those I'd met, but all the house's spectral inhabitants. Their cries merged into a horrifying wail that could drive anyone mad. Finally, I reached the entrance and burst outside into the cold night air. Turning back, I saw the house ablaze with unnatural fire. The flames were blue and green, and screams of tormented souls echoed from the windows. Perhaps destroying the phone disrupted not only their control over me, but the system binding them to this world. The house collapsed, and with it, its ghostly residents vanished. But my relief was short-lived. At home, I found that Soul Connect had somehow restored itself on my spare tablet. Worse, it now contained countless contacts, hundreds, thousands of souls from around the world who knew of my existence and wanted to meet me. Messages poured in relentlessly, each more insistent and threatening than the last. I realized destroying the house hadn't solved the problem. The app wasn't just software. It was a magical tool existing in the digital realm, independent of physical devices. The dead worldwide now saw me as a source of energy for their return. Deleting the app was impossible. It reappeared on any device I touched. The following days were a nightmare. The dead appeared everywhere. Home, work, the streets. They no longer hid or feigned friendliness. They demanded, threatened, tried to force me to give up my energy. I stopped sleeping, eating, and barely left the house. Colleagues thought I was having a nervous breakdown and insisted I take medical leave, but rest didn't help. The dead grew more aggressive. They began affecting my surroundings. Electronics failed. Tap water turned icy. Food spoiled instantly. They stripped away everything that sustained life, trying to break me. I sought help from doctors, psychologists, even priests, but no one believed me. They attributed my story to mental illness and offered antidepressants. Some suggested hospitalization, but I knew a hospital would be worse. The dead would reach me more easily there. Gradually, I began to give in. My strength faded daily, and my will to resist weakened. The dead sensed this and intensified their pressure. They claimed if I surrendered willingly, it would be quick and painless. They painted the afterlife as a place of peace, free from suffering and loneliness. In the end, I knew I'd lost the battle. I had no allies, no knowledge of how to fight the dead, no strength to continue. One late November evening, I wrote a final letter explaining everything that had happened. I knew no one would believe it, but I wanted to leave some trace of the truth. Then, I left home and headed to where it all began, the old park where I was supposed to meet Elena. The dead were waiting, hundreds of spirits standing among the trees. Elena stepped forward and offered her hand. This time, I didn't resist. When she touched me, I felt life drain from my body. It wasn't painful, as she'd promised. More like slipping into a deep sleep after a long illness. The last thing I saw was Elena becoming more solid and alive as I dissolved into the night's shadows. The next day, my body was found in the park. Doctors declared cardiac arrest from unknown causes. No injuries or signs of foul play were found. My letter was dismissed as the ravings of a mentally ill person. Soul Connect vanished from the internet as suddenly as it appeared, leaving no trace. Somewhere in the city, a young woman named Elena began a new life, working as a teacher and eagerly pursuing her long-held plans. No one noticed her documents were fake, or that she spoke and acted as if from the early 20th century. But that was no longer my story. It ended that cold November evening in the old park, when I realized that death is not an end, but a transition to another existence, where the boundaries between past and present, desire and reality, are forever blurred.